Greetings, friends, and welcome to Oh, the Places You'll Go. We're visiting places I've been to, some that you've been to, and not just, this isn't Rick Steves, right, talking about tourism. We're trying to think theologically and spiritually about places and what we can learn there. So I thought for this episode, I would take you to Rome. I grew up with some fantasies of Rome. I'd never been there as a kid, but for some reason, Rome fixed in my head. I had a teacher in high school, she taught Roman history. I just wanted to go to Rome. I got to go when I was a young man, stay there for a month. Just very lucky. That was great. And I've been back quite a few times, and I just love the city. There's some energy about it, something, I don't know, it just speaks to me. So the first time I went to Rome, I had that month to spend there. I started in the usual places. I went to the Roman Forum. I went to the Colosseum. I went to St. Peter's. I went to the Sistine Chapel. And I've been back with family, and we've done the usual touristy places. Lisa and I went to Santa Maria in Cosmedin. That's the church that's featured in the movie Roman Holiday. Audrey Hepburn and Gregory Peck. And neither's being honest with each other and go to this mouth of truth, right? They put the hand in there. It's like a funny scene. Lisa and I reenacted that. I thought I'd share a photo with you of that. I have an email. I'm doing an email series. It's not identical to these, but it runs in parallel. I did one, it was kind of odd, on restaurants in Rome. That sounds like a crazy thing. People often go into Rome and they'll say, where's a good restaurant? And I'll say, any of them. It's Italy, the food's going to be good. I do have two recommended restaurants, and they're mentioned in that video. One is a place called Da Pancrazia. I went there first time I went to Rome with my friend Philip. Neither of us had much money, so we generally ate with the monks and other students for the priesthood that he was studying with, but we sprang to go out a couple of nights. We went to Da Pancrazia. It's built over the ruins of Pompey's Theater, which is where Julius Caesar was killed. So I always go back there. I've been there with family. I've been there with friends. Just a lovely place. Food's fabulous. You sit outside. You watch people walking. Vintage Rome. It's just a special, but it's special because of my memories of being there over time with different people. And then there's another little obscure restaurant. It's not far from the Pantheon, but it's on a little back street, so no Americans find it. My friend in Rome found it, Il Buco, and I always go back to Il Buco. And the amazing thing is there was this waiter there in 1984, the first time I went. He's still there, I think. At least last time I went, he's still there, Franco. He's been there 30 plus years. Great waiter. Anyway, that's around the corner from the Pantheon, a little further into the city, around the corner. Here are interesting churches to me, beyond the obvious ones. So around the corner from the Piazza Navona is a church called San Luigi, St. Louis. It's French church. And you go in there, and it's really dark, so you need some coins, some euros, and you put them in the slot, and the lights come on, and you see Caravaggio paintings. And one of those is his Call of St. Matthew, which is one of his greatest paintings. He's envisioning Jesus calling the disciples. The story is that when he was painting this, he just went out on the street from his studio and found some guys that were lounging around the seats. Said, come in here. And they came in and sat. And suddenly they're disciples, and we're looking at them years later. That's the great thing. Around the corner from that church is a church called San Agostino. You may think about St. Augustine in Florida. St. Augustine was a saint, late 4th, early 5th century. He was a brilliant young man, but wasn't a Christian. And his mother, Monica, wept over him in her prayers. And the Bishop Ambrose saw her and said, it's not possible that the child of so many tears should perish. Sure enough, he came along, and then he converted, and shortly before Monica, his mother, died. She's a saint now in the church. When she first died, they buried her in Ostia, which is the port city right outside Rome, there in Italy. But later, they took her sarcophagus, and they moved it and built this church, San Agostino, named for her son. And they perched that sarcophagus up on the wall. So I was eager to go see this. It's not a main tourist thing. And I went into the place. This was just so moving. The church was totally dark and quiet. And I got close to where I'd read that Monica's sarcophagus was. And I just heard a voice. It sounded like crying. The voice kept repeating, Mio Bambino, Mio Bambino. Mio Bambino, I realized that it was a mother. And she'd come to pray at the tomb of Monica, who's kind of the patron saint of all lost children for mothers. Mio Bambino, my child. I don't know what was wrong with her child. I didn't need to know. I just sat back and watched her pray. I tried to pray with her, she never knew that I was there. It reminds me of the poem Mary Oliver wrote. It's a very short poem, and I love this, thinking about St. Augustine and how long it took him to come around. He became a great saint of the church. Her poem is this: things take the time they take. Don't worry. How many roads did St. Augustine follow before he became St. Augustine? That's a great church. It's never crowded with tourists. I love it. There's another church in Rome out a little ways called Santa Maria della Concezione dei Cappuccini. It is the weirdest church in Rome because you go down into the crypt and the bones of 3,700 Capuchin monks are down there. These guys would die, and then after their bodies deteriorated, they would take their bones. They took the bones and made it into all this artistic decoration in all of these chapels down there. It is creepy to beat the band. And I love it, right? It's because they have some sense that they're brothers who have died over many, many years, that they're part of our worship together and part of the communion of the saints. That is one weird church. Another church in Rome that I love that, again, tourists don't get to, and I do this on my St. Francis tour. I take people, you think Francis, Assisi. When we go to Assisi, we start in Rome. And St. Francis came to Rome. So there's a church called San Francesco in Ripa. That's St. Francis on the river. It's right on the river, Tiber. And it's the church where it was built over the place where when Francis was coming to visit Rome, he would sleep there. Right? And he used a stone as a pillow. And I'd read about this. And I thought, man, I want to try to find this. And I read somebody's travel log that said, if you go in the church, you'll never see where Francis slept or anything about it. But if you find the priest and ask him nicely, maybe if you make an offering to the church, he'll show you the place. So first time I went in there, I've been back several times. I found the priest, and he pulled out this great big ring of these ancient keys. It was amazing. And let me in, climb up these narrow, harrowing steps, and you come to the cell where Francis slept. Of course, he slept on a stone. That's what he always did. He used a stone as a pillow. He felt like, God created that stone. I'm close to God's creation. I'm close to Jesus, the rock of ages. It's a great thing. I took my son there, and he had that kind of look like, man, we're sneaking in somewhere. It's a good kind of feeling. I love places like that. St. Francis came to Rome. This is pretty interesting because he'd had this, great experience of God. You remember the story. He'd been a wealthy young man, and then he kept praying to Jesus and what do you want me to do? And Jesus, I want you to give away your wealth and become St. Francis. Serve the poorest of the poor. So he went to Rome to talk to the Pope about it, to get the Pope's permission. So he looks really shabby by this time. He's giving his nice clothing away. So he goes to the church that in the 13th century was the Papal Palace. It's where the Pope lived. The big Vatican and all hadn't been built up yet. And so he comes to this church, San Giovanni in Laterno. There's some ancient things in that church. Most of it's sort of 18th century Baroque, which I find to be kind of gaudy and ugly. But in Francis' day, he came and he knocked on the door of the place, and whoever answered the door saw this shabby person. He said, I would like to speak to the Pope. And the guard said, no, go away. So he closed the door. Francis didn't mind being treated shabbily. But the guard reported this to the Pope. Said there was a guy, a shabbily dressed guy out there. I sent him away. And the Pope said, oh, okay, good. They were lavish and wealthy then. Anyway, that night, the Pope had a dream. And the artist Giotto has captured that dream in many frescoes that you can find around Italy. And in his dream, the church is falling down. And there's this one shabbily dressed peasant who's holding it up. And the Pope thought, that must be God telling me about the guy that came. So he told the guard, go out in the streets, find that guy and bring him back. So he found Francis and brought him back. And Francis said, I've been praying and starting this thing. I wanted to start a new order in the Catholic Church. And the Pope said, well, tell me about it. And Francis had the description of what the strategy for the new order would be. And we actually have copies of this in the hand of St. Francis. And it's just a string of Bible verses. Jesus did this, Jesus did this, Jesus touched lepers, Jesus spoke to people that nobody else saw, whatever. And that's Francis's strategy. Like, we're just going to do this Bible stuff. And I love that. And the Pope said, go for it. At the time that the church was really opulent and defensive, the Pope authorized this man to go out and just do what Jesus did. I've told some of you this story before. When I was in Davidson, the bishop, sent down this thing, churches need to write a new mission statement. So I thought, oh gosh, it's going to be wordsmithing for a year to get this thing done. So I gathered a committee of people and I explained the task. The bishop says we need a new mission statement. And a woman said, that's ridiculous. She said, that's the easiest thing in the world. Our mission is to do the stuff that Jesus told us to do. We looked at each other, we wrote that down and went home and sent it in. We're supposed to do the stuff that Jesus told us to do. That's what Francis did. There's another lovely church in Rome that absolutely no tourists find unless you're in my group. I'll take you there. It's called Santa Pudenziana. Santa Pudenziana, 2 Timothy chapter 4, verse 21. Sometimes you're reading Paul's letters and you name some of these other Christians that he's hanging around with, and it mentions a guy named Pudens, P-U-D-E-N-S. Well, from Roman records, we know that there was a senator at about that time named Pudens. And so we think, well, maybe this would be amazing, this senator who had converted to Christianity, and according to tradition, he had 2 daughters. One of them was named Pudenziana, so the church is named for her. And they engaged in charitable work all over the city of Rome. When Peter came to Rome before he was arrested and imprisoned, the first place that he stayed, according to tradition, was in the home of Pudens. This church, Santa Pudenziana, is built over the ruins of the home of Senator Pudens. This is just really interesting. To me. So you go into the church, and there are a couple of things about it that are amazing. One is this church has Rome's oldest Christian mosaic, and Rome's got a lot of old Christian mosaics, but this has the oldest one. And it shows Jesus with his disciples. And what I love about Jesus in this mosaic, he's not this kind of skinny guy. He's pretty robust, strong looking. And he doesn't have this well-coiffed, trimmed beard. He's got like some of the beards people grew during COVID, right? It's like a big, robust beard. I love that. Jesus is like that. The other interesting thing about that church, so many churches in Rome are like museums. That's always the risk for the church, right? Is that we'll become sort of a relic to some Christian past. A lot of churches all over the world are sitting empty. They're beautiful architecturally. The thing about Santa Pudenziana is they have got one active church there. Every time I go by, it is bustling with activity. They're gathering things to take to the poor. That was the tradition of Pudenziana and her sister. And when Peter first came to Rome. So they don't treat that just as, that's kind of what Christian heritage was. See, let's try to get tourists to come here. They have people that come there. They have an active congregation. It's just buzzing with life and young people. I love that. That's what churches are called to be. We have this treasured past, but it's to be alive today and keep that going. Another church that a lot of people don't get to in Rome is Santa Sabina. Up above the ruins, there's not many ruins, up above the Forum and such. Up on a steep hill there is the church Santa Sabina. It's pretty tough climb to get up there, a more daunting taxi ride. When you get up there, one thing, outside they have the best views over the city of Rome any place. I mean, you just take photos forever. It's fabulous. Then you go into the church. It's one of the oldest churches in Rome. And it's the sort of home headquarters church of the Dominicans in the world. Now, St. Dominic, contemporary of St. Francis, went and lived there in this place for a long time. So you're at a place like Dominic lived here. According to one tradition, St. Francis came there when he came to Rome and met Dominic. Here's like the two holiest saints of the Middle Ages meeting each other. Like, it's just an absolutely lovely thing. And then maybe you've heard of St. Thomas Aquinas, who may be the best Christian theologian ever, certainly in the Catholic Church. He was a Dominican, and he came and lived in this church. And in the church, you can visit the cell where he lived. Tiny room. I mean, smaller than a guest bathroom in a modest home, right? That's where he lived, and he wrote his great theological work called the Summa Theologica. And you stand there, and he sat in this cell and thought about God and wrote about God magnificently. So moving to think about people who have helped us to understand God. I mentioned a couple other places, then I'll be done. A church that some tourists get to is called San Pietro in Vincoli. That's St. Peter in Change. If you're walking from the Forum to the Colosseum and you turn left, you go up a steep hill, and you come to this church. It's not spectacular looking architecturally at all. It's called St. Peter in Chains because once Peter was arrested in Rome, he was chained. So the church has at the altar these chains. Who knows if they're the right chains? Doesn't matter. It's a tradition, and what it speaks to, right, is the image that we're chained to Christ. We might suffer for Christ. We're devoted to Christ. We're not going to be far from Christ. We think of, Paul said, I am Christ's slave, his servant, chained to him. That's a beautiful image. Nobody notices the chains, though. Because when people walk into the church, their attention is drawn to just the right of the altar, and it's the tomb of the Pope Julius. And the tomb has so much that's amazing about it in terms of sculpture. It's all by Michelangelo, but the pièce de résistance is his Moses. It's huge. It's bigger than life. I mean, Moses is big, and I love Moses here. I mean, he looks muscular and strong, and Michelangelo, he was so good at sculpture, right? He looks like he's seated, but he looks like he's about to get up. He's not looking straight out, he's looking to the side. Is he pondering where they're going to go next? Is he thinking about where does God fit in all of that? It's so amazing. It's noteworthy because Michelangelo depicted him, as everybody did in the Middle Ages and the Renaissance, with horns. Now some of that was anti-Semitic, right? It's like, oh, they're devils. Awful, awful stuff. But actually, in Moses' case, if you read in Exodus 33 and 34, Moses goes up on Mount Sinai, and when it comes down, it says, his face shone. His face shone. When they translated the Bible into Latin, they weren't very good at Hebrew, so they made a boo-boo. Instead of saying his face shone, it's just one letter off. They said that his face had horns. So Michelangelo is still picking up on this. To me, his Moses doesn't look devilish at all. He's not demeaning Moses. He really admires the power that is in this man. Now, a while back I read a book about Michelangelo by the art historian named William Wallace. And I love how he describes this, because it took Michelangelo most of his adult life to finish this sculpture. So he lived in his studio. It was over near St. Peter's, which is, I think, 3 miles from where the statue wound up, and it was in Michelangelo's home while he worked on all these other projects, Sistine Chapel or whatever. So as Wallace puts it, he says, Michelangelo lived with Moses. The two grew old together. Every morning the artist woke up with Moses. Like, there he is. Every time he returned home, he was welcomed by the same imposing figure. And he adds, to live with Moses could be unnerving. You can imagine. I've tried to think about that for myself. What would it mean for me to live with Moses? Moses, in various guises, right? He was courageous. He did hard things for God. God asked him to do what was impossible. He said, I can't speak. And God says, I'm going to use you anyway. He has immense courage, immense frustration. He tries to lead the people. They're not very leadable. Moses goes up on the mountain for weeks and has an intimate connection with God. What would it mean for me to live with Moses, to be close to Moses in that? Moses has the commandments. They're not like rules, but that they're God showing us the way. What would it mean for to live with him? It took Michelangelo decades to finish the statue. Well, finally he was done, and they had to go install it. So they had this 3-mile journey. So they put it on a cart. It's huge. Imagine this. drawing this cart there. And here's the way William Wallace describes that. So it's moving through the city. He says, a few astonished persons stood gaping as Moses, peering over the side of the cart, slowly rolled through the streets of Rome. I love that. You come out of your house like, there's Moses rolling down my street. Fabulous thing. Last couple of things I want to mention. Of course, you have the catacombs in Rome, and they're so worth visiting. Catacombs are underground burial places, and they weren't just used by Christians. They were used by all kinds of people in Rome. The Christians were very devoted, though, to the catacombs, because for Christians, in ancient Rome, they always put the graves outside the city. Romans did not wish to think about death. They did not wish to see death. So they put it outside the city so they wouldn't have to deal with it. Christians love to think about death. They love to visit the graves. Why? They felt like the grave was a portal to heaven. For the Romans, when you died, you were dead. But for the Christians, when you died, there was something more fabulous beyond. You lived on eternally with God, transformed into something magnificent and glorious. So they would worship at the tombs, thinking like, this is as close as we can get, one, to our saints who have departed, but also the closest that we can come to God and to heaven and to our eternal destiny. So they worshiped in those catacombs. There are a lot of catacombs around Rome and in other cities. Paris has catacombs. In Rome, most tourists go to the catacombs on the Appian Way, and they are really cool, but there are always a bunch of tour buses there, and it's crowded, and that makes me crazy. So when I take groups, I go to these catacombs. It's called the Catacomb of Priscilla. And it's never crowded, never has too many tourists. There's some nuns there who are so kind and helpful, and they have a lovely gift shop, and they'll bring you a cup of coffee. They're really fabulous. The art on the walls is what's interesting. So the Christians would gather in the catacombs to worship, and then they would paint images on the wall. And there are always images from the Bible that suggest hope and eternal life. One is, for instance, the story of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego from the book of Daniel in the Old Testament. Here you have three young men. They are persecuted by, the king Nebuchadnezzar. They're in the fire, but God delivers them through the fire. These early Christians were persecuted for their faith. So this is a story that meant the world to them. They're persecuted, but yet there's hope beyond that. It's an absolutely beautiful thing. The last absolute thing, another underground burial. This is the most splendid thing in the entire city of Rome. And if I don't tell you to try it, you'll never go there. You have St. Peter's Basilica. Everybody goes there. What people never get to is what's called the Scavi, S-C-A-V-I. So under St. Peter's Basilica, under the crypt of St. Peter's Basilica, which you can visit, archaeologists went under there because they knew that the original St. Peter's Basilica that was torn down in the Middle Ages and rebuilt during what we think of as the time of the Protestant Reformation, right? That church, the one that Michelangelo Bernini helped to build, under all of that was the original St. Peter's. So they dug under to see what they could find. What they found was a necropolis. That's a city of the dead. It's a huge cemetery. They found it, and they realized that that's where Constantine decided to put St. Peter's. Right, is in the cemetery in Rome. Well, why did he choose the cemetery in Rome? Well, the reason is who was buried there? St. Peter. Jesus said, you're the rock, and on this rock, Matthew chapter 16, on this rock I will build my church. Peter goes to Rome. This is the tradition, of course. Peter goes to Rome, he dies, and he's buried. People are like, where? Well, here's the cemetery over which Constantine, who people were still around who kind of remembered where things had happened, Constantine believed that Peter had been buried there. So archaeologists got really interested. So they say, oh, this is a cemetery. And so they excavated whole streets with mausoleums on either side of the street. It's an absolutely magnificent place. It's huge. And you walk around under there, and the tour guide takes you to the place where they believe St. Peter was actually buried. And when you hear their whole shtick, at the end, you just think, I think he was buried here, because that's precisely over the point of the high altar in St. Peter's. You can't just walk in there. You have to apply for tickets ahead of time. You just Google Scavi, on the internet, and you find it, and you apply for tickets. Now, sometimes people aren't able to get tickets, but you can get the tickets. They're not real expensive. It's like five euros or something. It's just absolutely the most splendid, stunning thing, and you realize you've come face to face with where Peter was buried, Jesus' most important, I would say, disciple. Anyway, Rome is sort of an endless warren of treasures. I hope to get back there one day. I hope to lead a group back there one day, and I hope you'll come with me. It's an absolutely splendid city. There's just spiritual lessons at every turn, so much that we can learn about God, about the church, about ourselves, about the world. Absolutely wonderful. Thank you for joining me on this tour of a city that I hope you can tell that I really love. We'll keep visiting other places week by week in this series.